Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Barbara Mistick, President of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. Over the course of her 30-year career in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, Barbara has been an entrepreneur, educator, and leader at institutions such as Wilson College, Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, and the H.J. Heinz School of Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University, and the National Education Center for Women in Business at Seton Hall University. All these experiences were a precursor for her taking the reins at NICU just in time for the pandemic to hit. And she joins us today to discuss the challenges that private colleges and universities are facing and what they should be doing going forward to be sustainable in this new normal called COVID. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Drum. Good to be with you.
Oh, it's great to have you. I've been looking forward to this. Your communications director, Pete Boyle, and I have had a number of really great conversations, and I think this is just going to be a wonderful podcast for the guests when we talk about what's going on with the private higher education institutions, of which you lead their association.
Yes, we've got, there's 1,700 private nonprofit colleges across the country. So it's been a very interesting time for every one of them.
Yes, and unfortunately that ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, comes to mind when you say interesting.
Yes, it absolutely does. And I think there are many people now that we're 9 months into this that wish they were not living in interesting times.
I don't think of anyone who has said, hey, the last 9 months have been a lot of fun.
No. As a matter of fact, my dear mom, who's 92, says that we are not in this together, that she feels like she's in it alone. And I think that's been one of the challenges in this crisis, is that it has been so very personal. We're very fortunate, you and I, to be talking today. We're fortunate to have work that's meaningful and valuable for us. But there's so many others that have lost their jobs or unemployed throughout this crisis, who are dealing with a lot of isolation. So it's been a very difficult time for everybody.
It has, and I was reading just the other day, around 50,000 of our colleagues in higher education have lost their jobs due to the pandemic. I mean, those are big numbers.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that the number of jobs that are down across the sector, so it wouldn't just be in private institutions, but across the sector, is almost 500,000 jobs. And the anticipation by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that about 150,000 of those jobs are not going to come back post the pandemic. So this is certainly a time of significant change and adjustment within all of higher education.
Yeah. And for the world. I mean, both of us, I don't know that you've ever experienced anything like this. I never have.
Oh, no. And you know what astounds me, actually, Drum, astounds me on a daily basis, is that we didn't have much warning that this was coming. So I remember in February, first of all, I'm new at NICU. I've been there just about 16 months now. So when I started last September, I really wanted to get to know our various state executives around the country and all of the associations that we work with. And so I spent a fair amount of time traveling like crazy. And as a matter of fact, last February, I was on the road 26 out of 28 days that month. And I got back into Washington on the 28th of February. And it was really literally that was either a Saturday or a Sunday, that following Tuesday, I just had this sense that the world really was going to be different, and it was going to be different very soon. And most of the conversation I was having with our colleagues and our members in the higher education sector was about bringing students home from study abroad programs. I don't know if you remember that. That seems so
yes.
far ago that we traveled like that and that we did study abroad programs. And there was not a sense that this was going to be a permanent thing or a semi-permanent thing, that it was going to last for months. We were really looking at it lasting for weeks. And so we certainly find ourselves in very uncharted waters, don't we?
We certainly do. And like my friend Gordon Gee said, the pandemic has accelerated needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more. There's been a lot of disruption, which, most boards, how do you plan for a pandemic? How do you plan for everything getting shoved online within 2 weeks of notification? I don't think you can really.
Well, I think, there's a song I always remember at moments like this when you're talking about the unexpected happening, and it's the Sunscreen song, Baz Luhrmann. So I don't know if you remember it, but it's like you can never plan for that random Tuesday when something just happens. And so it just takes your training, and it takes extraordinarily good sense, and, really being able to look after your community. That's what it's taken from every single leader in the nation around the pandemic. Everybody's had to respond differently depending on what sector you're in or what kind of community you're dealing with. But it has called on everybody to be in this crisis mode. And, I think the difficult part is being in a crisis for so long. We can often, you've seen this in crisis management and turnarounds, people can rally their energy and they can do lots of things for a sustained period of time, especially if they've got an inspirational leader that's helping to guide them. But there is a point at which the fatigue factor weighs in. And I think that's the part that is really difficult right now. The pandemics like this, I don't know if you've looked at some of the ones in the past, which luckily neither of us were around for, but there is like a beginning period, when it is this crisis. But then there is a whole interim period where you're not out of the crisis. Like for us, we still have hotspots happening around the country. We have higher infection rates, all sorts of places. And at the same time, we have this prospect of the vaccine coming down the pike too. So you're not out of the woods, right? But you're hoping to get there. But these periods can last, what I've been reading is a couple of years. And so between both the crisis and this interim period, that's a long time to be leading through a pandemic and through a crisis.
It certainly is. And when faculty came back in the fall, they were already burned out because they had been, swapped courses. Most institutions didn't have online programs, so everything got swapped to online. The back and forth in the fall term as far as, we're going to be face-to-face. Oh, not so fast. I think we need to go, or we'll end the term early, etc. There was a lot of whiplash that went on. And it's those type of behaviors under high stress that burn people out.
Well, I think what you're talking about, Drum, is the uncertainty. And so there was a lot of uncertainty for students. There was a lot of uncertainty for families, but there was also a lot of uncertainty on campuses. So, people were looking to their senior leadership team. They're looking to see, how they're going to respond to the crisis. And in many ways, I think we are a very optimistic set of leaders when you're in the presidential seat. You're often the primary cheerleader for your community, for your school, right? So that sense of optimism, I think, had us thinking we were going to get past this quickly and that we would get to a different phase, and that would happen before the fall semester started, or it would happen now that we're sitting in January, it would happen before the spring semester started. but that hasn't happened. So everybody, whether you're, at the presidential level or whether you're at the faculty or student level, everyone across the institution was feeling that kind of uncertainty. And, part of it, I think it's fair to say that there was a lack of a national response. And so what's happened was each and every state was responding differently. So we've seen a lot of difference, whether it's in New York, which had an early hotspot, California that had both early hotspots, but continuing challenges in California. So very different results, very different behaviors than perhaps what you saw in Idaho or what you saw in South Carolina. So, that was very difficult, particularly for our sector, which is made up of a great number of residential colleges, a great number of institutions who have students from all across the country, actually all across the world, right? Difficulty in getting students into the country to start the semester. There was difficulty in getting students from one state to the next state. The question of quarantining made things all the more complicated. So, at one point, the mayor of the District of Columbia had 48 states on the list from which you would have to quarantine. So can you imagine if you were coming into Howard University, one of our members, right, and you had to quarantine from all of these states? The president there said to me, it's just too complicated. It's just, in many ways, institutions were, faculty and staff could be a little frustrated with the president, but often the president could be frustrated with the political leadership around them because that was creating decision making for you that you weren't party to. So these are all of the things that make it so difficult to be effective and to be thoughtful about your community when you're in the midst of a crisis.
You're spot on with that. It's crazy. I work with a lot of Christian colleges and universities, and you can just imagine the tension between their own belief system and what the counties and the cities and the states are trying to do as far as gatherings, things along those lines. It was very challenging for many of them. But you hit on a really...
We have a number of members who are Christian colleges too. And I remember a point in time, this is probably back in September, maybe the end of August to September, those institutions were very concerned because Governor Newsom was going to close institutions and not allow them to open in California. And one of the things that's so beautiful about our sector, in particular private nonprofit colleges, is the diversity of our institutions. And so some of them are small institutions where that personal relationship is so key to the delivery of learning and the delivery of their educational system that they wanted students to be back in person. So we saw everything this past fall. We saw institutions that did have in-person delivery. We saw institutions that had hybrid delivery. We saw institutions that had fully online delivery. So and some of them had all of those methods of delivery in the same semester. So it was really a very complicated, challenging semester. And that made it very difficult for faculty and for students because, they were looking for, in the midst of this kind of a time, this kind of topsy-turvy time, you look for any level of certainty. And there just didn't seem to be one available.
The term whiplash comes to mind.
That's a good term.
And so what are some of the things that you saw that institutions did a really good job in adapting to this rapidly changing environment that we had in spring and in fall terms?
Well, Drum, I'd say at a global level, at the highest level, what I saw most was an incredible amount of adaptability. Institutions were very flexible. And this is, for those of us in higher education, those are words that are not often applied at the same time, right? That you're flexible and adaptable because we think, we have to study it for a couple of years and then we've got to take it to the faculty senate and then it's got to come back and forth. But what you saw here was really people responding very quickly. And what I, felt most encouraged about was how how institutions really put students first. That's what I saw over and over again. I can't tell you how many times I'd have a conversation with someone in the press and they'd wonder about what was going on at institutions. And what was just clear to me was everybody was putting their students first. Student safety was number one, bringing students home. We were talking about from study abroad programs at the beginning, but bringing students back to campus, how to do that safely. Some institutions changed their calendars. I mean, it was the amount of change is really just commendable. What institutions did to be prepared, I saw institutions take on perhaps like 4 different scenarios, strategic scenarios for reopening in the fall. So, one of them would study if we can open fully in person. Another one would study the hybrid option or the online option, or maybe moving to a quarter system so that if we had to move students off campus quickly, that they wouldn't lose the semester. So what was fascinating to me is no matter the method that people were looking at, that the guide star for all of them was to make sure that students were able to continue their education, that it would be a good experience for students, and that students would be safe.
Mm-hmm. And those are all critical things. One of the things that I saw, and it's right in line with what you're saying, is they became much more mission focused. They define their mission as serving students, preparing students for their next career, whatever that might be. And some of the things that we saw there were just fabulous.
Absolutely fabulous. And what's really interesting is that Congress saw that too. And there's been somewhat of a disconnect, I think, with Congress for many years. We have this great program that was started nearly 50 years ago, the Pell grant program that helps low-income students. And in private nonprofit colleges, some of our institutions might have upwards of 50% Pell eligible students. Some institutions, it varies by institution, of course. But, the Pell Grant program, when it started, really covered almost 70% of the cost of attendance. And the Pell Grant program today covers less than a third of the cost of attendance. And so what we've seen is a diminution in the support from Congress for students and for higher education. So I think what was really interesting was when the CARES Act came out in March, is that there were direct grants to students that came via institutions. You don't often see that kind of mission alignment, particularly between Congress and higher education, 2 really big and complex institutions. But there was a connection there. And the connection was about how do we help students and how do we help students get through what's, a very unusual time in our history. And so that was a tremendous takeaway to see everybody working together.
It really was. And I think, my background coming from faculty and administration, things along those lines, I was really encouraged to see how much faculty came on board to make these changes as quickly as they needed to be done. I mean, without that, the institutions would have just been sunk.
Right. Now, we often get, kind of tied up in the things that we aren't doing well, so we think we should be changing faster. We think we need to adjust our program mix on a more expeditious manner. But what we really saw is when the chips are down and we really need to be working together, you saw the best of the academy. I totally believe that. Faculty is concerned about students and helping them to get through. Student life folks really coming up with all sorts of creative ways to help students be successful, navigate not having technology at home. I mean, really, one of the things I think is striking, and I've kind of been dealing with this for perhaps close to 20 years in my career. I spent some time heading up a library system in Pittsburgh a little bit earlier, actually Andrew Carnegie's very first public library. I've always understood how important broadband access was, particularly in the library system. It was for primarily majority minority neighborhoods or just there's just not universal broadband access. Then when I became a college president, I had so many students who came from rural areas. I was struck once again by the lack of broadband access. And then as schools closed down in March, we saw, even where there were big public institutions, a lack of broadband access, and students were driving to sit in parking lots in order to complete their studies on their computers or laptops or phones. So many students trying to work on phones. So, of course, this challenge is true for K to 12 as well as it is for higher education. But I am encouraged that there are additional dollars in this stimulus grant that was just passed at the end of 2020 for broadband access. And I think that's something that will help all of our institutions, but will also help all of our communities across the country.
I think you're absolutely right. So along those same lines, going forward, what are some of the things that you feel privates need to be doing to ensure the students still have access and they're still student-centered? Given the pandemic, the vaccination's coming, but it's still going to be a while, it looks like, for most people to get it. So what are some of those things that privates could be doing, should be doing?
I think, the things that our institutions should be doing are probably the same things that other institutions should be doing. We have to make sure that we find ways to make receiving your education affordable and accessible. Vast sections of our country who don't have full access to education, and we need to make sure that they do, that they can go on from high school and get a college degree. And it is the thing that makes a difference for students today going from high school to college. There's several markers. The unemployment rate is much lower for college graduates than it is for those who are just high school graduates. As a matter of fact, in the pandemic, I think we are now at an unemployment rate of about 8.8%, close to 9% in the country. It's higher by almost threefold higher for those with only a high school degree. So getting a college degree is the surest path to economic mobility in our nation. And we have to make sure that that is accessible to those who have less resources, who have less access to resources in the country. And so I think what that is going to require, and it's certainly important to private institutions, but for public institutions too, is to see the Pell Grant increased. There has been a lot of discussion. Often whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, we're competing against each other. Publics and privates compete pretty regularly for students. But the one thing that we're aligned about is that we need to do better in terms of financial aid for students. And one of those is really taking a look at doubling the Pell Grant. I think that would have the greatest potential to both help private institutions and to help students, and also to help public institutions. So it would, I think it would be a boost for the entire higher education sector.
I agree. I think it's a great thing. And of course, that's at odds with the way that Congress has worked of late in wanting massive tax cuts. So you've got to figure out how to pay. I think under the Biden administration, where he has specifically said he believes education is a public good, and perhaps we will be able to see something like the increase in Pell Grant going forward.
No, I think it would make a tremendous difference. For so many private institutions, what's actually interesting is that private institutions have about 20% of all the students in the nation, but we give out 30% of the degrees. So what happens is that there's an effectiveness ratio that's higher at private institutions than it is at public institutions. I think the best thing for us to do is to recognize that there is diversity. There is a value in diversity in our ecosystem, our higher ed ecosystem. So maintaining private institutions and public institutions really helps us do better by all students. Students have different learning styles. Some students do better at a smaller institution. Some students are well prepared for a larger institution. And right now you have the opportunity to access any part of that system. I don't know where all of your degrees are from, but my undergraduate degree is from a private institution, but my master's degree is from a public institution, and my doctorate degree is from a private institution. So if I just look at myself as an example, I've gone back and forth between the private sector and the public sector in getting my education. So how about for you, Drum? What would you?
Well, for me, I didn't really have undergrad education. I more had a technical training called the Naval Academy. But
Well, that's a whole great sector too.
it is. Although lately the news coming out of our rival West Point with the cheating scandal isn't real good. But at Naval Academy we shouldn't crow because we've had our own.
Right.
But then for my graduate degrees, I was at a very small private institution out of Santa Barbara called, at my time, it was the Fielding Institute. And now it's the Fielding Graduate University. And their president out there has just done a fabulous, fabulous job at the institution. But, I agree with you. There's got to be a diversity between publics, privates. I think we need to do a better job in financing education, making it more of a public good like Joe Biden wants to do. It is a pathway for social mobility, especially for low-income and first-generation students. And we need to do a better job in that. The economy, the health of the nation, to me, is tied up in the middle class. And if we don't create a path to the middle class for folks, then it becomes a nation of have and have-nots, and that's not what America's founded to be.
No, it's not, and I think this pandemic has only exasperated how this have and have not dynamic is going on right now. So we have people who are unemployed and on unemployment and need that lift up, and then we have people who are still continue to be employed and just like us are working in their home offices. And so, there's just such a need post the pandemic to have people who are educated and ready to step into the workplace. And if you look at various states, they have various educational attainment goals based on industries that are in each of their states. And in most states in the nation today have a goal for a certain level of college attainment, but yet the number of students who have attained that are much lower than the percentage that the state needs. So what they're looking at is the needs in the workforce and the level of skills and training that are required, and then how many people can meet those skills. If states can't maintain that, then the state can't be competitive, particularly trying to bring in new employers and new industries. So I think it's not just the things that we're talking about, Drum, but it's going to be recovering from the pandemic. Recovering from the pandemic is going to require higher education to pull together and be able to really turn out graduates that are prepared. I think one of the things that concerns me in the pandemic is that we've seen a drop in the number of low-income students that are applying to college. I think this is problematic for our sector, private nonprofit colleges, but it's problematic across the ecosystem. And what happens, as you well know, we're a 4-year cycle, right? So if we bring in a small class, we have less students applying and that's going to impact our sector for several years. So I think if you've looked at, the assistance that Congress has provided thus far to higher education, it just hasn't come even close to what the needs are in the sector. We're looking right now, the latest bill that passed at the end of the year, the $900 billion stimulus package, about $23 billion of that will go to higher education. The request from the higher education sector was for $120 billion, which means that $23 billion, while we are extraordinarily grateful for the support, we're grateful that Congress is thinking about us, that is especially true. It's only about 15 or 16% of what we needed. So, institutions are testing on a regular basis. There's just new reports out on a daily basis that maybe you should be testing twice a week instead of just once a week, that you need to do more in terms of social social distancing. And yet what we know is that students really want to be back, and they want to be back on campus, and they want to be back in the classroom. And so, there's just such a tension right now that we're going to really have to figure out how we can continue to support higher education so that it can help us come out of this pandemic and be stronger economically as a nation.
I fully agree. Unfortunately, I'd love to keep going, but we are getting close to the end of our time. 2 questions. What are the 3 takeaways that you would give to university presidents and boards that you want them to remember from the podcast and what they could be doing going forward?
I think given the times that we're in, one of the things that is extraordinarily important, seems to end up in my email inbox every single day, is figuring out how to be resilient. My takeaway from working with college presidents, for seeing how dogged and dedicated they've been throughout this crisis, is that this is an opportunity to not just be resilient, but to actually do something I call bouncing forward. So it's not just bouncing back. If you bounce back, you're in the same place you were before. You might have had a setback, but you're back in the same spot. I think this is an opportunity, as we've been discussing, to really bounce forward. I mean, there are some silver linings, I think, to this crisis. One of them is that Congress has been supporting the higher education sector in both the CARES Act and in the stimulus bill at the end of 2020. So I think we need to continue to do a good job in advocating for our sector and for the important value of helping this next generation be productive Americans and be active in our workplace and our workforce. I think the other piece is about students, taking a look at how much students have said, I don't want to just be an online student, that there is real value to the residential experience. And I have seen that over and over again. At the beginning of the pandemic, every press interview that I was doing, people in the press were like, they're all going to be online from now on, right? And honestly, you talk to students, they don't want to just do this at home on their computer. They want the community around them. They want students around them. They want their faculty. They want to be able to have impromptu discussions, meet people with different interests. So, that's part of the growing up experience of going away to school, going away to college. And the students who have been impacted in this year, both last year and this coming year in the pandemic, are going to want that experience even more. So I think that's a great thing to think about as you redesign. A lot of people are saying that hybrid is going to be here to stay, or some version of hybrid will be here to stay. But I think thinking about how we connect students to, even if we are still in a hybrid mode. And then finally, I'd say the communities that we're in. One of the things that has been really remarkable is seeing how much particularly I see this with private nonprofit colleges, I'm sure you see it with everyone, is how much they're a part of their community. So they're doing testing not just for their campus, but for their community. Now we have so many institutions that have signed up to be vaccine centers in their community. So they're supporting not just the students that are there, not just the faculty that are there, not just all that economic residual spending that goes on, the nights in the hotels at graduation and all the excitement around sporting activities, but they're really supporting how the health and safety of their communities and how their community comes back. Those are very important takeaways as we not bounce back, but bounce forward.
I like that term. I'm going to borrow that, bounce forward.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And so what's next for you, Barbara, or NACU? Did I say that right? NACU?
It's NICU, but
NICU.
You can say NACU or you can say NICU. As long as you're saying one or the other, it works for me.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
The next thing for us is we have our annual meeting coming up. It's just the beginning of February, and we're going to spend a lot of time on advocacy. Really talking to. We're going to try doing a virtual advocacy day, this is the one gift for everybody, right? In the pandemic, we keep learning new technologies, right? So we're going to try another new technology and do a virtual advocacy day. We have, our member institutions, our colleges are in almost 400 of the 436 congressional districts. So rather than bringing everybody to Washington, I guess we're going to bring everybody to Zoom. That will be exciting. It is a brand new Congress. It is the 117th Congress. So there's a lot of new work to do. There are a lot of new members to work with. There's a new administration to work with. We have our work cut out for us in terms of really making sure that we do a good job of introducing everybody to what happens in our sector and the differences among the different parts of our ecosystem and the value that we bring to our nation and to our communities.
Well, good luck with that. Yours is the first that I've heard for a virtual advocacy day, and I think it's a wonderful idea.
Well, you're just like you and I are here virtually. Our elected officials are on Zoom too. And so I've done a couple of, several conversations with elected officials on different virtual formats. And, they're like us, they want to know what's going on with their constituents. So we're hoping that it's all going to work out and be a great experience. But stay tuned. You'll have to have me back to find out how that went.
I absolutely will. It would be a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it, Drum.
Well, thank you for taking time with me today, and I look forward to the next time.
It was my pleasure, and I'd be pleased to be back with you. Thank you.
Very good. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Barbara Mistick, President of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, and for her sharing her thoughts on what private colleges and universities are doing to grow and stay sustainable in the new normal and post-COVID. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com to learn how they can help you grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model with no risk or long-term contracts to your institutions. Our next podcast, we welcome back Tom Mars, Assistant Director of Texas A&M Center for Executive Development, who'll be joining us to talk about the stressors employees and faculty have been dealing with over the past 9 months of the pandemic and what we as university leaders can do to help them going forward.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.